It was close to midnight when Mrs. Chen pulled her Mercedes-Benz out of the hospital parking garage. The sleek black car purred softly as she navigated through the quiet streets, her mind still focused on the emergency brain surgery she just completed. After 14 intense hours in the operating room, she'd managed to save a young patient's life. Despite her exhaustion, a small smile played across her face as she thought about giving the good news to the family in the morning. The streets of Pine Grove, her upscale neighborhood, were nearly empty. Elegant streetlights cast a warm glow on the tree-lined avenue as she drove past the familiar rows of beautiful homes. She'd moved here 3 years ago after being appointed as the head of neurosurgery at Central Medical Center. The neighborhood had everything she wanted: good schools for her kids, friendly neighbors, and most importantly, it was just 10 minutes from the hospital. Tonight, like many others, she'd missed dinner with her family. Her husband had texted that he'd saved her favorite pasta in the fridge, and her 2 children had left sticky notes on the kitchen counter wishing her good luck with the surgery. These little gestures always warmed her heart, making the long hours worth it. As she turned onto Maple Drive, just 2 blocks from home, she adjusted the temperature control. The early spring night was chilly, and she was looking forward to a hot shower and her comfortable bed. The dashboard clock showed 11:45 p.m. If she was lucky, she might get 5 hours of sleep before her morning rounds. Mrs. Chen hadn't noticed the police cruiser that had been following her for the past minute. She was thinking about tomorrow's schedule when suddenly, bright red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. The police siren chirped twice, signaling her to pull over. Confused but calm, she guided her car to the side of the road, making sure to stop under a streetlight for better visibility. This was an affluent, low-crime area, and she hadn't been speeding. Maybe one of her taillights was out. She reached for her purse on the passenger seat, where she kept her license and registration. The events that would unfold in the next few minutes would not only change her life, but would spark a movement for positive change in her community. But at that moment, sitting in her car with her hands properly placed on the steering wheel as she'd been taught, Mrs. Chen had no idea that this routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine. Through her side mirror, she watched as a police officer approached, his hand resting near his hip. His flashlight beam swept across her car, lingering on the luxury brand emblem on the trunk. Even before he reached her window, something about his demeanor made her reach up and switch on her car's interior light. Years of experience had taught her to be prepared for moments like these, though she never thought she'd face one in her own neighborhood. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of what her parents had always told her: stay professional, stay calm, and always know your rights. As the officer's footsteps grew closer, Mrs. Chen pressed the small button on her dashboard, activating the car's built-in camera system, a feature she'd hoped she'd never need to use. The officer tapped on Mrs. Chen's window with his flashlight. She pressed the button to roll it down, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. The cold night air rushed in, bringing with it the sharp scent of the officer's coffee breath. "License and registration," he demanded, not bothering with the usual polite greeting. His nameplate read Officer Wilson, and his tone carried an edge that made Mrs. Chen's doctor instincts kick in. Something wasn't right here. "Good evening, officer," she replied calmly, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" Officer Wilson's flashlight beam swept across her face, then around the car's luxury interior. "This is a nice car you're driving," he said, ignoring her question. "Very nice. Mind telling me how you came to be driving it?" Mrs. Chen felt her chest tighten, but her voice remained steady. "This is my car, officer. I own it. Now, could you please tell me why you've pulled me over?" "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his hand moving to rest on his belt. "I don't feel comfortable doing that, officer," she responded firmly. "I've done nothing wrong, and I'd like to know the reason for this stop." The officer's face hardened. "Listen here, I said step out of the vehicle. You people always want to make things difficult. I'm sure if we run the plates on this car, we'll find something interesting. Mrs. Chen's heart was racing now, but years of handling high-pressure situations in the operating room had taught her to stay composed. She reached slowly for her phone. "Officer, I'm going to call your supervisor now. I have every right to know why I have been stopped." "Oh, you're one of those types," he sneered. "Think you know the law? Think your fancy car and fancy clothes mean something? For all I know, this vehicle could be stolen." Mrs. Chen pressed the emergency button on her phone, a feature her husband had insisted she set up. "Officer Wilson, I'm Dr. Chen, head of neurosurgery at Central Medical. I've just finished an emergency surgery, and I'm heading home. Everything about this stop is being recorded, including your refusal to state the reason for pulling me over." The mention of her profession seemed to throw him off balance for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Doctor or not, when an officer gives you an order, you comply. Last chance. Step out of the vehicle." Just then, another set of headlights illuminated the scene. A second police car pulled up behind Officer Wilson's cruiser. Mrs. Chen let out a small sigh of relief when she saw a female officer step out, the shift supervisor she'd requested through her emergency call. The supervisor's footsteps crunched on the gravel as she approached. Mrs. Chen could see Officer Wilson's demeanor change slightly. He straightened up, his hand dropping from his belt. "Everything all right here?" the supervisor asked, her eyes taking in the scene. The luxury car, the professionally dressed woman behind the wheel, and her officer's aggressive stance. "Just a routine traffic stop, Sergeant," Officer Wilson muttered, but his voice had lost its earlier edge. The supervisor turned to Mrs. Chen. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Rivera. Could you please explain what's happening here?" As Mrs. Chen began to speak, she knew this moment wasn't just about her anymore. Her dash cam was still recording, capturing every word, every gesture. Sometimes, she thought, the hardest moments in life become the most important ones, the moments that create real change. Taking a deep breath, Mrs. Chen began explaining the situation to Sergeant Rivera. Her voice remained steady, though her hands were shaking slightly on the steering wheel. 20 years of handling life and death situations in the operating room had taught her how to stay composed under pressure. "I was driving home from an emergency surgery at Central Medical when Officer Wilson pulled me over," she explained. "He hasn't given me a reason for the stop, but he demanded I step out of the car and made several comments about my vehicle potentially being stolen." The dash cam continued recording as Sergeant Rivera listened attentively. The night had grown colder, and Mrs. Chen could see her breath forming small clouds in the air as she spoke. She thought about her children, probably fast asleep at home by now, and how many times she told them to always stay calm and dignified, no matter what. "My credentials are right here," Mrs. Chen continued, slowly reaching for her purse. "My hospital ID, driver's license, and the car's registration. I've owned this Mercedes for 2 years. I bought it to celebrate becoming department head of neurosurgery." Officer Wilson shifted uncomfortably as Mrs. Chen handed her documents to the surgeon. His earlier bravado had deflated, but Mrs. Chen could still feel his resentful stare. She'd faced that kind of look before, in college, during her residency, even sometimes from patients who didn't expect someone like her to be their brain surgeon. "Everything appears to be in order," Sergeant Rivera said after reviewing the documents. She turned to Officer Wilson. "Why exactly did you initiate this stop?" Officer Wilson mumbled something about suspicious behavior and unusual for this neighborhood, but his words trailed off under the surgeon's stern gaze. Mrs. Chen thought about letting it go. It was late, she was tired, and her bed was calling. But then she remembered the conversation she'd had with her daughter just last week about standing up for what's right. Her little girl had asked why some people treated others differently, and Mrs. Chen had promised her that change happens when good people speak up. "I'd like to file a formal complaint," she said quietly but firmly. "Not out of anger or revenge, but because this needs to stop. I've lived in this neighborhood for 3 years. I've saved countless lives in this community. Yet tonight, I was treated like a criminal for driving my own car home from work." Sergeant Rivera nodded, pulling out her notepad. "I understand, Dr. Chen. I'll need your statement, and we'll also need a copy of your dash cam footage." As Mrs. Chen began giving her statement, she noticed more patrol cars arriving. Word had gotten out that a senior police officer was involved in an incident. The flashing lights painted the peaceful suburban street in surreal colors of red and blue. She could have been angry. She could have raised her voice or let emotions take over. Instead, she chose to handle this moment the same way she handled difficult situations in the operating room, with precision, clarity, and purpose. Each word she spoke into the surgeon's recorder was measured and factual. Her phone buzzed, a text from her husband asking if everything was okay. He could see her location hadn't moved for a while on their family tracking app. "Just handling something important," she typed back. "I'll tell you all about it when I get home." This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. As Mrs. Chen sat in her car, giving her statement with quiet determination, she knew this moment could help create the change she wanted to see, the kind of change that would make the world a little better for her children, her community, and everyone who had ever felt unfairly targeted. As more police cars arrived at the scene, Sergeant Rivera was handling the situation with the kind of professionalism that gave Mrs. Chen hope. The surgeon's presence had completely changed the atmosphere. The night air was still cold, but the tension had shifted into something more productive. "Dr. Chen, I want to personally apologize for your experience tonight," Sergeant Rivera said, handing back the documents. "This is not how we train our officers to conduct traffic stops, and this is definitely not how we treat members of our community." Mrs. Chen nodded, watching as Officer Wilson stood by his patrol car, speaking with another officer. His body language had completely changed from the aggressive stance he'd taken earlier. Now he looked more like a student who'd been caught breaking school rules. "You mentioned you have dash cam footage," Sergeant Rivera asked, pulling out an official-looking form. "That would be extremely helpful for our internal investigation." "Yes," Mrs. Chen replied, pressing a few buttons on her car's touchscreen. "The system automatically uploads to my cloud storage. I can send you the file right now." She paused, then added, "You know, I installed this camera system after a colleague recommended it. She said it might come in handy someday. I never really thought I'd need it." As they waited for the file to transfer, more officers gathered nearby, speaking in hushed tones. Mrs. Chen could hear fragments of their conversation, words like inappropriate conduct and racial sensitivity training. She noticed how some of the younger officers were shaking their heads, clearly disappointed in their colleagues' behavior. A small crowd of neighbors had started to gather at the edges of the scene, drawn by the unusual number of police cars on their quiet street. Mrs. Chen recognized her next-door neighbor, still in his pajamas and robe, watching with concern. He gave her a supportive wave when he caught her eye. "Dr. Chen," Sergeant Rivera said, drawing her attention back, "I'm going to need you to fill out this official statement form. But first, would you be willing to tell me if you've experienced similar incidents in our jurisdiction?" Mrs. Chen thought carefully before answering. "Not with your department," she said honestly. "But this isn't the first time I've been questioned about driving this car. It's just the first time I've decided to do something about it." The surgeon's face showed genuine concern. "That's troubling to hear, but I'm glad you're speaking up now. Change only happens when people are brave enough to stand up and say something." As Mrs. Chen began filling out the form, she could hear Sergeant Rivera giving firm but professional instructions to Officer Wilson. Words about immediate suspension and mandatory review floated through the night air. The sergeant was handling everything by the book, making sure every procedure was followed correctly. Mrs. Chen's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from the hospital. One of her post-op patients was asking for her. Even in the middle of all this, Her first thought was for her patient's well-being. She quickly typed out instructions to the night nurse, demonstrating the same calm professionalism she'd shown throughout this entire incident. Just a few more minutes, Sergeant Rivera assured her, noticing her checking the phone. "We'll have you on your way home soon. But I want you to know, this won't be swept under the rug. What happened here tonight will lead to real changes in our department." Looking around at the scene, the gathering of officers, the concerned neighbors, the dash cam footage being processed, Mrs. Chen felt a subtle shift in the air. Sometimes, she thought, the most important changes start with one person simply saying, "This is not okay." Tonight, that person was her. The morning after the incident, Mrs. Chen sat at her kitchen table, a cup of green tea growing cold beside her laptop. She barely slept, but her mind was clear. After sharing what happened with her family over breakfast, her husband had encouraged her to take the morning off, something she rarely did. "You need to do this right," he'd said, squeezing her shoulder supportively. Their kids had already left for school, but not before giving their mom extra tight hugs. They could sense something important was happening. On her screen, Mrs. Chen carefully typed out her experience from the previous night. Every detail mattered. The time, the weather, the exact words used. Her training as a surgeon helped here. She was used to documenting things precisely. The dashcam footage was already saved in 3 different places, thanks to her tech-savvy husband's advice. Her phone buzzed with messages of support. Word had spread through the neighborhood group chat, and neighbors were sharing their own stories. One message caught her eye. It was from another doctor at her hospital, describing a similar experience from just 2 months ago. "I should have spoken up then," the message read. "Thank you for being braver than I was." Mrs. Chen took a deep breath and picked up her phone. She'd saved the contact information for the local civil rights organization that had helped her cousin with a workplace discrimination case last year. As she dialed the number, she remembered her daughter's school project about people who changed their communities. Maybe this was her chance to be one of those people. The conversation with the civil rights lawyer was eye-opening. "You're not alone," the lawyer told her. "We've received several complaints about similar incidents in your area. But having clear video evidence, that's crucial. And your professional standing in the community, this could be the case that makes a real difference." Mrs. Chen spent the next hour sending emails. One to the police department's Internal Affairs Division, another to the Civilian Oversight Committee. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard as she composed the next one. Finally, she typed, "To the police chief's office. Request for meeting regarding systematic bias in traffic stops." Her hospital ID badge caught her eye, sitting on the table where she dropped it last night. She thought about her patients, people from all walks of life who trusted her with their lives. They didn't care what she looked like or what car she drove. They cared about her skills, her dedication, her humanity. The doorbell rang. It was her neighbor, the one who'd witnessed part of last night's incident. She brought coffee and homemade cookies. "The whole neighborhood's talking," she said. "We're behind you. This isn't just your fight anymore." As they sat talking, more messages arrived. Other professionals in the area sharing similar stories. A local news reporter requesting an interview. A community organizer asking if she'd speak at the next town hall meeting. Mrs. Chen looked at all these messages, feeling the weight of responsibility. She could have let this incident go, could have chalked it up as just another bad experience. Instead, she was choosing the harder path, the path of change. She opened her laptop again and started a new document. Proposal for Community Police Relations Reform. Her medical training had taught her that treating symptoms wasn't enough. You had to address the root cause. Maybe that's what this community needed, not just punishment for one officer, but real, lasting change. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Sergeant Rivera, following up as promised. "The internal investigation is officially opened," the message read. "Your statement made a difference. This is how we make things better." Mrs. Chen smiled slightly as she typed her response. Sometimes the most important surgeries weren't the ones she performed in the operating room. Sometimes they were the ones that helped heal a community. 2 weeks after the incident, Mrs. Chen sat in a conference room at the police headquarters, surrounded by internal affairs investigators. The room was bright and professional, with large windows overlooking the city. On the table in front of them, her dash cam footage played on a large screen. "Please pause it there," said the lead investigator, pointing to a specific moment in the video. "Dr. Chen, could you tell us again what Officer Wilson said at this point?" Mrs. Chen had watched this footage so many times now, she could quote it word for word. But what surprised her most was how many people had come forward after hearing about her case. The investigation had uncovered a pattern that couldn't be ignored. "We've reviewed Officer Wilson's body camera footage from the past 6 months," another investigator explained, spreading out documents on the table. "There's a clear pattern in his traffic stops. The numbers don't lie. The statistics were right there in black and white. Out of all the luxury vehicles Officer Wilson had pulled over, an unusually high percentage belonged to minority drivers. Most of these stops had no clear traffic violation noted in the reports." Mrs. Chen's phone kept buzzing with supportive messages. A group of local business owners had come forward with their own stories. A respected professor from the local university had shared security footage from when he was stopped in his own driveway. Each story added weight to the investigation. "Your case opened the floodgates," the lead investigator said, shuffling through more papers. "People who were afraid to speak up before are finding their voice now." The police chief walked in, looking serious but determined. He'd been keeping close tabs on the investigation since it began. "Dr. Chen, thank you for your patience through this process. What we've uncovered here goes beyond one incident or one officer." Mrs. Chen thought about all the hours she'd spent in this building over the past 2 weeks. She thought about her children asking every evening how the meetings went, about her husband making sure she ate dinner no matter how late she came home. This wasn't just about her anymore. It had become about making their community better for everyone. "We found 17 similar complaints that were never properly investigated," the chief continued. "Some were dismissed without follow-up. Others were marked as resolved with no action taken. This stops now." Outside the window, Mrs. Chen could see people going about their daily lives, driving to work, walking their dogs, living in a community that could be better. Should be better. One of the investigators pulled up another video on the screen. Dashboard camera footage from other traffic stops. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Same officer, same aggressive approach, same targeting of drivers who didn't look like they belonged in expensive cars. "The officers' union representative has been notified," the chief added. "There will be a hearing next week. But Dr. Chen, I want you to know, this investigation has already led to changes in our department. We're reviewing all traffic stop procedures. We're implementing new training programs. Your courage in speaking up, it's making a real difference." Mrs. Chen looked at her watch. She had surgery scheduled in 2 hours. Life hadn't stopped while she pursued justice. If anything, this experience had shown her how to be even more focused, more determined in everything she did. "There's something else," the lead investigator said, pulling out one final document. "We found similar patterns in other precincts. This could lead to a county-wide review of traffic stop policies." As Mrs. Chen gathered her things to leave for the hospital, she felt a mix of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing justice being served, but also hope for real change. Sometimes the hardest moments in life became turning points for entire communities. "We'll need you to testify at the hearing," the chief said as she stood to leave. "Your voice matters in this process." Mrs. Chen nodded. She had surgeries to perform, patients to heal, and a family to care for. But she would make time for this too. Because sometimes healing a community was just as important as healing a patient. 1 month after the incident, the police department's main conference room was packed with officers, community leaders, and local residents. The police chief stood at the podium, announcing changes that would reshape how the department operated. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, still wearing her surgical scrubs. She'd come straight from the hospital to attend this important meeting. Today marks a new chapter for our department, the chief began, his voice firm and clear. The recent investigation has shown us where we need to improve, and we're taking decisive action. On the screen behind him, a list of new policies appeared. Every officer would now wear body cameras that couldn't be turned off during traffic stops. All stops would be reviewed monthly for patterns of bias. But the biggest change was the creation of a new civilian oversight committee. Dr. Chen has agreed to serve as one of our committee members, the chief announced, nodding in her direction. The room burst into applause, causing her to blush slightly. She hadn't done this for recognition. She'd done it for change. A young officer raised her hand during the question period. "Will these changes make our jobs harder?" she asked, voicing what many were probably thinking. The chief smiled. "These changes will make our jobs better," he replied. "When the community trusts us, everyone is safer, including officers." Mrs. Chen watched as the room filled with honest, sometimes difficult conversations. Officers sharing their own concerns about bias they'd witnessed but hadn't known how to address. Community members offering suggestions for better communication. It wasn't always comfortable, but it felt real. During a break, she checked her phone. There was a message from her daughter. "Mom, my teacher used your case as an example in social studies today." Next to it was a proud face emoji. These changes were already reaching the next generation. The afternoon session focused on the new training programs. Every officer would attend monthly workshops led by community members. They would learn about different cultures, hear personal stories, and practice better ways to handle traffic stops. "We're not just changing rules," the training coordinator explained. "We're changing how we think about our role in the community." Mrs. Chen noticed Officer Wilson sitting at the back of the room. He looked different now, humbler, more thoughtful. The investigation had led to his suspension and mandatory retraining. But instead of fighting it, he'd asked to be part of the solution. Near the end of the meeting, a retired officer stood up. "I've been on the force for 30 years, he said, his voice shaking slightly. "What happened to Dr. Chen? It's happened before. We just never had the courage to face it. Thank you for helping us do better." As people began to leave, Mrs. Chen checked her watch. She had just enough time to make it home for dinner with her family. These meetings had become a regular part of her life now, alongside her surgical duties and family time. The chief caught up with her at the door. "The other precincts are asking about our new programs," he said excitedly. "This could spread across the whole state." Walking to her car, the same Mercedes that had started it all, Mrs. Chen thought about how one moment of injustice had led to so much positive change. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from another doctor, from a different city, asking for advice about starting similar programs there. As she drove home, she passed a police car making a traffic stop. She noticed how the officer was following the new procedures. Professional, respectful, clear about the reason for the stop. Small changes, adding up to something bigger. Her husband had dinner waiting when she got home. "How was the meeting?" he asked, already knowing from her smile that it had gone well. "We're making progress," she replied, hugging her kids. Real progress. 6 weeks after the incident, the police department's training center buzzed with activity. Officer Wilson stood at the front of the room, facing a diverse group of community members. His badge was missing, replaced by a visitor's pass, a visible reminder of his suspension. "I was wrong," he began, his voice quieter than it had been that night with Mrs. Chen. "For years, I told myself I was just doing my job, being thorough. But watching that dash cam footage, seeing myself through others' eyes, it changed everything." The community dialogue session was part of his retraining program. Instead of losing his job, he'd been given a chance to learn and change, but only if he was willing to do the hard work. In the audience, Mrs. Chen sat next to her husband. She hadn't planned to attend these sessions, but the chief thought her presence might help other officers understand the impact of their actions. She watched as Officer Wilson shared his story. "I've been a cop for 15 years, he continued. I thought I knew everything about this job. But sitting in that review board hearing, listening to all those similar complaints, I realized I didn't know nearly enough." The room was silent as he described his mandatory sensitivity training, the counseling sessions, the ride-alongs with officers from different backgrounds. He talked about the moment he realized his instincts had really been prejudices in disguise. A small business owner raised his hand. "How do we know you're not just saying what we want to hear?" The question hung in the air, heavy with skepticism. Officer Wilson nodded, accepting the challenge. "Actions matter more than words," he replied. "That's why I've asked to work with the training department after my suspension. I want to help other officers learn from my mistakes." Mrs. Chen watched as more people shared their stories. A grandmother who'd been afraid to drive at night. A college student who'd changed his route to avoid certain police patrol areas. Each story seemed to affect Officer Wilson deeply. During the break, Mrs. Chen's phone lit up with a message from the hospital. One of her patients was asking about her, the same one she'd operated on the night of the incident. She smiled, remembering how life's different paths often crossed in unexpected ways. Back in the session, Officer Wilson was explaining the new traffic stop procedures he helped develop. "We're changing how we approach every vehicle," he said. "No more assumptions. No more gut feelings about who belongs where. Just clear, professional procedures that protect everyone's rights." A young officer in training raised her hand. "What about officer safety?" she asked. "We're taught to be cautious, to trust our instincts." "Being professional doesn't make us less safe," Officer Wilson answered. "If anything, treating everyone with respect makes our job safer. I wish I'd learned that earlier." As the session ended, Mrs. Chen watched people gathering in small groups, talking honestly about their experiences. Officer Wilson stayed to answer questions, looking each person in the eye as they spoke. Her husband squeezed her hand. "You made this happen," he whispered. But Mrs. Chen shook her head. This was bigger than her now. It was about a community learning to do better. Before leaving, Officer Wilson approached her. "Dr. Chen," he said, his voice catching slightly. "I know an apology isn't enough. But seeing you here, supporting these changes, it means a lot." Mrs. Chen looked at him thoughtfully. "Change isn't easy," she replied. "But it's always possible if we're willing to learn." Walking to her car later, she passed the training center's bulletin board. A new poster announced next week's community police basketball game. Another small step in building better relationships. Sometimes, she thought, the biggest changes started with simple human connections. Her phone buzzed again, her daughter asking if she'd be home for dinner. "On my way," she typed back. "And I have a story to tell you about how people can change when given the chance." 1 year after that fateful traffic stop, Mrs. Chen stood at a podium in the police academy's graduation ceremony. The room was filled with new officers, their families, and community members. As she looked out at the faces before her, she couldn't help but smile at how much had changed. "When I was asked to speak at today's graduation," she began, "I thought about what message would matter most to new officers. Should I tell you about that night? About the investigation? About the changes we've made?" She paused, letting her words sink in. "But instead, I want to tell you about what happened after." In the front row, she could see Officer Wilson, now working as a training instructor. He nodded encouragingly. He'd become one of the department's strongest advocates for community-focused policing. "This past year, our community has shown what's possible when we work together," she continued. "Traffic stops are down 30%, but public safety has improved. Why? Because we build trust. Because we learn to see each other as neighbors, not strangers." The statistics displayed on the screen behind her told a powerful story. Civilian complaints had dropped significantly. Officer satisfaction rates had gone up. The department had become a model for other cities looking to improve their community relations. Mrs. Chen's daughter sat in the audience, beaming with pride. Just last week, she'd done a school presentation about how one person could make a difference in their community. She'd used her mom's story, of course, but also included stories of other community members who'd spoken up. To the graduating class, Mrs. Chen continued, "You're joining the force at an important time. The changes we've made here didn't just fix problems. They created opportunities. Every traffic stop is now a chance to build trust. Every interaction is an opportunity to show respect." She glanced at her watch, an old habit from her surgery days. But she wasn't rushing to an operation today. The hospital had given her the morning off to give this speech, understanding its importance. "Last month, I was driving home late from surgery again," she shared. "Another officer pulled me over. My taillight was out. The interaction was professional, respectful, and clear. That might seem like a small thing, but it's exactly what we've been working toward. Not just avoiding bad experiences, but creating good ones." The room was silent, absorbing her words. In the back, she could see the police chief nodding. The Civilian Oversight Committee had become a permanent part of the department's structure, with regular meetings that actually led to meaningful changes. "But the real success stories are the ones you might not hear about," she added. The young driver who wasn't afraid when they saw police lights. The officer who took time to explain why they made a stop. The community members who stepped up to help build bridges. Her phone buzzed silently in her pocket, probably another message from the growing network of doctors and professionals who'd started similar programs in their own cities. What had begun with one incident had sparked changes across the state. "So today, as you prepare to serve our community," she concluded, "remember that your badge carries more than authority. It carries responsibility. Every interaction is a chance to show what good policing looks like." The applause that followed wasn't just polite. It was heartfelt. As she stepped away from the podium, several new officers approached to shake her hand. Their faces showed genuine commitment to doing things right. Later, walking to her car, yes, still that same Mercedes, Mrs. Chen thought about how far they'd come. Her phone lit up with a text from her husband. "Proud of you." Simple words that meant everything. A police car passed by, and the officer waved. She waved back, smiling. This was what change looked like. Not just new policies or procedures, but a whole community learning to trust and respect each other, one interaction at a time.